All right. No, Chris, other side. Okay, well, good evening, everybody. Thank you all for coming, and welcome to those out there in YouTube Streamland. I hope you're settled in for a fascinating evening. Many thanks to Cisco for hosting us tonight and for taking care of all the broadcast part of it, which is very good, because usually that comes down to me sitting at the back pushing buttons on a PC, so it's nice to not have to do that one tonight. Tonight we have, very interesting, Pat Waddell is a longtime member of our section, and he's going to tell us a little bit about how we get our audio into MXF, right? Thank you very much, and over to you.
Good evening. Oh, I do hear myself in the overheads. Okay. This is an expanded version of a presentation that Bruce Devlin and Oliver Morgan presented at the ATC. And I've added to it because I'm not sure how much MXF everybody in the room understands. So I like to think of the two worlds that SMPTE deals with as far as media files go, or media goes, is either bits on the wire or bits on a disk. And the technology is subject to massive change in the industry right now, but that's sort of the two categories. So we're talking, in the case of MXF, about bits on a disk, or disk equivalent. And so if you think about what the PBS network has as a challenge for program distribution is, first of all, they're not a true network. They don't own any stations. They're all members, and they choose to affiliate or not. So deciding things like file formats and audio codecs and things such as that are potentially political decisions as much as technical decisions. So they have had a group working on file standards for the last couple of years. For them, it's very important to have it a standard and not a spec. And we'll touch on specs in a couple of slides. But one of the things they were particularly concerned about was having an audio codec that was not going to have decode, re-encode loss, the way that some of the early audio codecs do. And so they picked AAC. It's an MPEG standard. Its IPR is basically shared or owned because it was created by the big audio houses, including one we know and love up in San Francisco. And so this is a new standard that just was recently published as ST381 Part 4. So what I want to cover tonight are the user needs, because that's what drove a lot of the technical decisions. And then talk about one of those subjects that, for those of us that have worked in audio for a while, channels, how they get assigned, where they got placed on tape, all that sort of stuff. Once upon a time, you got a physical tape. You could actually look at somebody's label and figure out, what was where. Can't do that when you're distributing files. Audio fidelity is certainly one of the major concerns that they had. And then we'll dive into some of the specifics of the MXF itself. So what PBS wanted was a standard file format for the primary distribution to the end stations, understanding that that file was then going to be transcoded or decoded and re-encoded, whatever process is used at the local station. and readied for air. And that desire was to have as much of that automatable and lower the human issues. So they were looking for something that was very high quality, had a manageable file size, and the lower the better is always the case with store and forward. They also wanted something that was known to have a wide vendor support. And the last and hardly least was the ability to include metadata, sufficient metadata, because you needed to have the station automation system deal with this file correctly. So you didn't have a whole bunch of human QC that had to happen before it was air ready. And you had to be able to fit into their ecosystem. So all of that was really important, and we'll actually get into some of the messy details of the audio metadata later on. So that was one of the main drivers in the choice of AAC. So a bit of context here is this is the next generation distribution to the member stations. They called it SIX. I'm not quite sure what special meaning that has within the PBS organization. I didn't have to deal with that aspect of the project, but they have about 200 member stations around the country. And of those 200 stations, they logged that they had at least 40 different file mappings in the various server systems that people were using. So they needed something that was not going to have a whole lot of human intervention in it. They had had previous experience with MXF, and I should tell you, if you are not a file-oriented person, that MXF is intended to be a file representation of a 1-inch reel of Type C tape, for example, or a cassette. And that meant that it needs to deal with the video, it needs to deal with all the ancillary data, it needs to deal with the audio, it needs to have timecode, all that stuff, right? And MXF supports all of that. MXF was documented back in the early part of the millennium as a major SMPTE / EBU pushed / BBC cheering NHK bringing up the rear project, which meant that there was considerable attention from a couple of major Japanese manufacturers, one of whom I worked for at the time. And sadly, what happened was the two manufacturers interpreted the standard in different ways, and you ended up with a couple of different implementations that didn't interop all the time. So we ended up with a user group called the Advanced Audio Workflow, AMWA, I've got to get the right acronym here, that wrote some documents to constrain the MXF standard for interoperability. And a couple of those were AS03, there were AS0N, but what they did is they added some additional constraints over the global MXF toolkit, and then they were able to achieve interoperability amongst the various vendors. And PBS liked interoperability. I think that's really important for a network. That's hopefully fairly self-evident. Of the technologies that were made available in using MXF, video coding, MXF has documented both MPEG-2, H.264. At this point, they are beginning to add the H.265. And the PBS group evaluated the video coding, and they chose 15 megabits with and this is not a correct term for H.264 because it dropped the term GOP, but basically coding structure of 12 pictures in length. They wanted to support both 8 and 10-bit and 420 and 422 because different stations had different infrastructure. They needed at least 8 PCM channels, and we'll see why in a few slides. They wanted, 24 bits, and so what that translated into is that AAC was going to be coded at 320 kilobits for 5.1 or 160 kilobits for 2.0, and that gives very high fidelity and does not degrade under concatenation. So they initially started looking at one of the MXF operating points that were documented by SMPTE, OP1A, and even there they needed to further constrain it. So NEBA had created something called AS11. Some of that helped ensure interoperability, and some of it raised some anxiety. And we'll get to the anxiety coming up. It also, because they went with AAC, allowed the direct addressing of the audio channel layout puzzle. Now, it turns out within SMPTE, for those that have not been standardizing a couple of different times, how to do channel layouts. And I remember from my time working in a 24-track studio, you'd get tapes in on projects that stuff was everywhere. But typically you had a track list from the last tape op, and so you could use the patch panel and put them where you wanted them. That's not easily automated. Over the time, the EBU had tackled this, and they documented all they could find out there. There was somewhat 53 some odd formats. SMPTE's ST2035 has got 30 plus. Once again, the idea there was that we could categorize them and say that this is a ST2035 format 11B, and an automation system should be able to go, oh, Shazam, we know where things are. Doesn't work that way, unfortunately. So what this has led to is human intervention on an ongoing basis, and that really doesn't translate well in the file interchange part of the ecosystem. And it means that you've got to have humans doing a lot of QC, and you would really like to not have to do all that QC. So metadata within AAC is really fairly well thought out. They provide the ability to identify channels within the sound field. The metadata is lost if you transcode it to PCM for editing and staging, but there are ways to tunnel or maybe not transcode to PCM, because a number of editors will support AAC. As I said, there was another group besides 31FS that had done multi-channel audio labeling, and they were interested in digital cinema related applications. What they did, however, was to provide a very nice standardized metadata label and all the coding of all the metadata. It's independent of how the essence is coded, so it's not tied to AAC, it's tied to actually to MXF. And it can persist as you go through different file formats and databases. So it's one of those standards that came along at the right time, ST377 Part 4, and it was enthusiastically embraced by the industry, because if you think about the content creation folks, they are just overwhelmed by the Tower of Babel of different ways of doing things. And if you think in terms of being a network, PBS is, a good example of that, but, think in terms of the other big four, folks like Turner, Netflix. They're all getting content in from around the planet, and people may or may not follow their desired production guidelines. So labeling is vital. And even with labeling, there are still some issues. So one of those issues is the timecode. There are more than 50 ways to stripe a program. If you think about equipment that you probably have met and either loved or hated, maybe both, we know that you can end up with, some cameras support time of day, some simply do control track. Then beyond that, in the film side of things, there's key codes, edge codes, and all that. Widely levered was the BVU U-matic timecode track that was supported plus or minus in most of the decks. And then as we moved into 1-inch and 2-inch tape, you ended up with LTC timecode or VTC timecode. And oh, by the way, the code words on the LTC may or may not be directly related to the VTC code words. So just be aware of that. And that's common. Then into the MXF realm, there was ST328, which talked about how to put timecode code words into MPEG user data. There were a number of different variants about how to put it into the headers in the compressed bit stream. And then back into MXF, there were several different ways of carrying timecode in MXF files. Your head hurt? It probably should be. All of this led to 31FS creating a MXF study group report, and I will do my little bit of multimedia here for a moment. So that URL will take you to the SMPTE webpage, and there's now a growing list of reports. If you find the one on MXF study group, you have a nice little click through here. I won't do it. That takes you to a dialogue where it wants to extract your metadata, because the society really wants to keep track of who's downloaded the report and so forth. So that's SMPTE's version of our metadata here. But moving on, and back to tape transports. So let's take a sort of a detailed dive into what it takes to ingest a reel of type 1 1-inch tape with timecode. So there is a lower level source package required in MXF into which you begin to dump data as you ingest this tape. And this is what you typically find on the tape. This is it's a made-up example, but it's not a horribly unreal world example. And Oliver Morgan, who created the illustration, laid it out the way that he was accustomed to seeing VPR3 tapes laid out. And this is what I remember. So you had typically left, right, and a protection channel because you really didn't want to have timecode bleeding into your audio. And then the LTC and the VTC, and note in this example, they're not the same values. I think that's important for people to remember. They're frequently not the same values. So we then take the essence off, and we can begin to fill in the metadata within the MXF. So you tell that it's an MPEG picture. you've got WAV files, and you've got date and create date and label date and all that sort of good stuff. All of that now in MXF gets associated through the MXF pointer system with what's called a material package, which is sort of the top directory level data, and then you have a lower level source package that actually sort of really ties to the coded essence. So this is, getting into the messiness of MXF. This is one of the reasons why misinterpretation of the standard could lead to things that don't interoperate. And that was one of the early on problems with MXF. But the nifty thing about MXF is that it provides you the ability to put in markers, which if you think about media applications are typically really important, especially for raw footage or sports. And there's a bunch of different ways to do that. There's a standard suite called 2021, which is known as BXF. There was 377 Part 1, which provided a package marker object. There's various DCP is Digital Cinema Package. So the digital cinema folks had created their own set. And then over in AMWA, they'd created some additional ASX stuff. So there's, like with Timecode, there's a lot of ways to do this. And here's what it ends up looking like in a directory structure. You've got what would be considered fill, or, we're not concerned about this part of the tape. And now we have part 1, and then we'll have more stuff we're not concerned about for a while, and then we'll have part 2. And so we can set it up so we've got, proper sets of messages so that an automated system can actually find the stuff, which is, I think, one of the goals. So we were hoping to reduce the confusion of all of this by use of the MCA labels. And it turns out that that has been a very sound choice technically and operationally. The MCA drafting group was chaired by a guy who worked for Sony Pictures named Brian Vessa. Some of you may know him. Really, really sharp guy. He does enough hands-on audio production to where he's still current, but he's also managerial, so he's managing a group, and he's able to participate in standards writing and so forth. So Brian is kind of a neat, well-rounded individual. He understood that we needed to get metadata to cover all this stuff in the document from the start. So you've got to be able to deal with a channel-based system, which is what we're accustomed to or have been accustomed to. Oh, yes, we've got this stuff now coming at us like Atmos and the other stuff that's sound field based. So we need to be able to deal with all of that. And then, groups of sound fields. So when you're dealing with stuff that, as Brian was potentially cinema related, you can end up with stuff where you've got, a gazillion speakers or logical speakers around a big room. You need metadata for all of that. And the metadata is not only to help the humans keep track of what they've got, it's to help the system keep track of what it's got, and it's also, in the case of playback, to help put it in the right place. Otherwise, it doesn't work. So here's what the MCA labels translated into in the MXF header. They provided a bunch of different labels for video and then up to 8 different audio tracks, and those can be linked together. So you can keep going if you've got more audio tracks. But that then begins to play in this ecosystem we were just looking at, and we can now begin to label what this stuff is. And some of that labeling is related to some of the parametric, some of the descriptive, some of the, what's the content, what's, things like languages, what's it used for. And we've got a bunch of uses coming at us, not usually from the industry's drive, but from Congress. I trust you have heard about closed captions. We probably all know about closed captions, but we now have requirements to do descriptive video. We're probably going to need to also do some descriptive subtitles, because we have a variety of people potentially in a home that need to have information given to them in an emergency that if you need to read it on the screen, you need to be given it on the screen. If you need to hear it, you need to hear it. So there's a bunch of regulatory stuff happening. And Brian's group was aware of at least the beginning of some of that, and they did their best to account for it. It looks like they have done a pretty good job of it. So if we look at what the labeling for PBS ends up being, they typically are going to worry about if they're doing a 5.1 deliverable. They've got, let's see, does this, no, the laser doesn't laze. Up at the top of the left-hand column, you'll see the sort of classic surround layout, although the channel order may or may not be what you're accustomed to. So it's got center, left, surround, right surround, LFE, and so forth. Then below that is something labeled DV, descriptive video. And then SAP, which is typically second audio. And here is a good example of how the industry has painted itself into the corner because of the limitations we had in the 1990s and probably should have paid more attention to as we turned the corner on the new millennium. But a lot of delivery systems were wired assuming everything was only ever going to be stereo. And so when you suddenly discover that you need to have more than a couple of languages, it's no longer a second language. So in the Bay Area, if you haven't discovered them, go look for them. There's a UHF station up in San Mateo, channel 26. They, on the weekend, will change program language about every half hour. And they run through both of the Chinese spoken dialects, Korean, Japanese, I think a couple of the Filipino, and then various Indian dialogues, Vietnamese, and so forth. They cover the whole east side of the Pacific. And they've got a big audience, people that actually buy commercial time. So this is a money-making proposition. And yet, because of the pipes that the industry has built, they have to declare their languages as either English or other, or the, Comcast drops the bits on the floor, or, DirecTV or whoever. So these are the sorts of problems that we have as an industry. In writing standards like MCA, you need to be able to at least get past those barriers and hope that eventually a new system like, say, ATSC 3.0 is going to perhaps come along and provide people a chance to actually say what the language really is. So PBS is trying to be prepared for that eventuality, and we provided the ability to carry the right level of metadata. So let's take a quick look at what some of the practical impact of this is. If you look at what you've got in a file viewer like you might use in an edit suite, if you don't have the MCA labels, you've got this audio down here. Yeah. What is it? Well, if we label it, then the editor doesn't have to figure out what it is, and the edit system doesn't have to figure out what it is. You can react to it properly. So in this case, it was the surround group, and then the descriptive video, and then the SAP. So labels really, really help. So if you don't have the detail, it's like, what are they? Now we know what they are. And the thing is, the automation system can now begin to say, oh, I want to put center over on the 3rd channel of my server, not on the 1st channel, and deal with the routing of the bit stream to get it in the correct place for this station's playback system. But if you don't have the metadata, you can't do that automatically. So stepping back up the stack for a moment and talking about the wrapping of AAC itself, it had not been standardized for MXF at the point we started this project. When I was still working for Harmonic, I had begun to get a project started. We didn't get terribly far because there were some technical issues that needed to be dealt with. And then I ended up retiring, and PBS came along and said, will you consult for us and help us finish this thing off? And I was pleased to do that. The issue revolved around the fact that in a file format, you have some, assumed hunks of content that classically in file systems have been assumed that you're always going to have n bits for picture, you have n bits for audio stripe and so forth. And unfortunately, some people wrote file systems using those assumptions. So realizing that the AAC packets were much shorter than the video packets, people had said, we'll figure it out someday. And so we got to figure it out. And it was kind of interesting doing that. But the thing is that the reduced bit rate that AAC supports is a significant savings in disk space, which was important for PBS. So, they really liked having 25 megabits compared to 3.8 gigabits. So how do we deal with the synchronization issue? It turns out that MXF had built in a tool from the start to provide a potential solution. It just hadn't been used. And it's got a name that is a mouthful, and unfortunately got rapidly turned into an acronym. So it's something called a position offset table, which everybody refers to as a pause offset. So when you hear MXF weenies talking about pause offsets, that's what they're talking about. It had been standardized in 2003, but nobody built it. So there were a number of questions. Can they be proven sufficiently before you end up with multiple vendors? Can you provide enough guidance for implementers to where people are going to write code that does the same thing in each implementation? And, oh yeah, can they survive splicing and all the rest of the abuse that you get in a edit system? And it took our drafting group, which reported to 31FS, we recruited some of the other folks in 31FS that were more heavy hitters in some of the other topics to help us sort through this stuff, and yes, we can do that. And here's what it ends up looking like in sort of a draw it in it's a fixed size structure for the video and a fixed size structure for the audio, which it really isn't, but that's the way a lot of people think about how stuff actually gets laid down on a disk. So you can see the video frame is a whole lot bigger than the audio, and there are some video frames that don't have any audio associated with them because the audio, once you decode it, ends up covering a couple of frame times. So we had to be able to definitively identify which content package, which is the MXF-itis term for video frame, have to associate the audio with the right video content package. And so the way the pause offset table worked was that you could tell it offset plus or minus and how many pictures you had. And we did our best to write clear, coherent prose in the standard, but we also built, and this was a part of the project that took longer than I thought it would, but thanks to a couple of the more stubborn members of the drafting group, we actually did it the right way. I had built a spreadsheet that didn't have sufficient resolution. Oops. But folks realized it didn't have sufficient resolution, so by the time we got done with the spreadsheet, it does. And the spreadsheet now comes along when you buy the copy of the standard, you get the copy of the spreadsheet. And the spreadsheet will actually do the math for you as you're giving it different bit rates and so forth, so that it helps an implementer or a QA department at an implementer actually verify their implementation is correct and will interoperate. So we spent a number of months running round and round and yelling at each other about whether we were doing this right. But the goal was to make sure that we had enough detailed guidance to where we didn't have the issues that had occurred initially with MXF, where two of the big players didn't interoperate. And then we provided some sample files. So this stuff that's all available when people buy the standard, they get both the spreadsheet and the sample files. So it was published just mid-year as ST381 Part 4. It's what's now referred to in SMPTE jargon as multi-element standard. So it consists of the PDF of 381-4 as well as an Excel spreadsheet and some sample files, all bundled in together. The benefits of all of this from an operational point of view and from PBS's point of view was that they could achieve the file size reduction they needed, and they're having to move rapidly into the file delivery domain. Satellite systems are aging and becoming less reliable, and they have been able to get the synchronization and the metadata that they need. And the member stations have discovered that indeed the automated channel routing and automated QC is all working. So this, very impressive to work on something. And as I said a bit ago, it turns out there's 4 different TCs that are working on various parts of this ecosystem. And 34 CS and 35 PM are the 2 that deal with the sort of packaged media and the automated media delivery. 31 FS is responsible for the overall base standard for MXF. And then the standard has to have standardized machine parsable key structures to allow a machine to navigate through a file. And the way that is done is through these metadata key trees, and those are administered by 30MR. And 25 CSS is the digital cinema sound group, and as noted, they have been a very big help for getting all of this going. So, questions? Or are your heads totally spinning? This is was a really complicated, lots of moving parts system. And the document itself doesn't look that big, but there's a lot of moving parts. So anyway, thank you.
just curious as to when all this started and when it was first deployed. And
it has been actually in deployment probably longer than the document itself was actually officially published. PBS hired a consultant by the name of Oliver Morgan, who is one of the team that helps pull all this stuff together. He runs a company called Metaglue that focuses on delivery of metadata and metadata-driven systems, and he produces, amongst other products, golden test files. So Oliver was the guy that produced the golden test files. And with the golden test files, even before we managed to get all of the ballots passed and the comments resolved and so forth, the implementation groups, and there's at least 4 independent implementations, including one from my former employer, that are out there now, and as far as I know, there have not been any major issues reported with any of the interoperability. So that's just, it turns out the IMF group, which was 34CS, is dealing with the deliverable food chain flowing down from the movie studios. And IMF stands for Interoperable Master Format, right, thank you, Pat. And if you think about what you have for worldwide distribution, and nobody is doing anything that's not worldwide distribution anymore, given the ecosystem we have, you've got to deal with all of, getting the right language track, you've got to get the right subtitles, you've got to deal with, there may be some certain censorship items related to some parts of the world and all that. That's got to be automated. And so what that group has been doing is having what are referred to as plug fests. And that's been an ongoing activity for them that we have not had to do because Oliver built the golden test files. And that seemed, at least for the AAC and MXF, the key component was having test files. So it's, I think, up and running, and I've not heard any yelling and screaming from Alexandria, so I think it's smoothly up and running. So anyway. Okay, Keith?
Try this one. Okay. So this is great for PBS. Anybody else looking at doing a similar thing?
Yes. I'm not sure I can name the names because I'm not under NDA with any of them. I just know of significant interest from a couple of the 3-letter acronym networks. And I believe I've heard some rumblings from our friends in Atlanta. So yeah, this is a tool that I think is going to get fairly widely utilized because, again, it deals with the quality issues. For an audience where I know I've got more than 2 other AES members in the audience, the earliest audio codec quality expectations were, as you probably heard yourselves, horribly not met. MPEG-1 layer 2, MPEG-1 layer 3, otherwise known as MP3. AAC fixed almost all of those issues, and it's actually now what MPEG is building something called MPEG Surround or MPEG-H on. So there's a number of, I guess they're now 3rd generation codecs at this point, Pat, for the current. So people have learned from what not to do as far as, when you're compressing, you know you're throwing bits away. You have to, that's part of the problem. You got to know what you can safely throw away and what you can't. And the early audio codecs made some bad choices. So those are delivery mechanisms that are really code it once play it in the living room and hope nobody records it. So anyway, other questions? Well, thank you for being a rapt, attentive audience. And we can now go out in hopefully less packed traffic. Although, until I get out on Tasman, I don't know.
That's always a risk, isn't it? Yes. Okay, well, thank you very much, Pat, once again.
You're welcome.
And hi to all the folks out there in Streamland who had joined us and didn't actually have any questions. So that
And
was
the control system, folks can actually fade to black.
And we thank very much to, again, once again, thanks very much to Cisco for taking care of all the technology parts and pieces here. Very happy to have Pat Griffiths, SMPTE Vice President for Education. No? Executive Vice President. Oh, excuse me. Sorry. Yes, that's right.
Yes,
okay.
that's true. A true member of the SMPTE leadership team.
Say a few words, Pat.
Let me gracefully get out of the way.
Thank you. Thank you, Patrick. And good evening, everybody. I'm Pat Griffiths, Executive Vice President of SMPTE. So members of SMPTE, raise your hand. Oh, we have some potential members. So if you like this activity in audio and you're interested in the industry and the networking opportunity, I certainly encourage you to think about joining SMPTE. One of the big events we've been doing here that I think is of general interest to everyone is an event called Entertainment Technology in the Connected Age. And now for 2018, we're going to be doing it at the Google campus in Sunnyvale. And we'll have both a strategy track and a technology track. One of the big topics, Patrick was talking about machine readable kind of audio. Well, what if the machine is smarter than you because it's AI? And that's a big topic now in Hollywood. So we'll actually have a track talking about advances in artificial intelligence, machine learning, deep learning, and how they could be applied to a lot of the content creation stuff. So that event will be in June of 2018, June 13th and 14th at the new Google campus in Sunnyvale. So you can get more details, I guess, on the SMPTE website, but also our San Francisco section website eventually.
Yes, eventually we'll put up some notification up there on the San Francisco page. But yes, certainly it'll appear on the main SMPTE.org site. If you're not members, SMPTE.org. There's a button at the top that says join. Go join.
Keith and I were just looking at the venue. It's a brand new building for Google. We'll be in a room that can seat around 400. They have a huge new state-of-the-art Sony C-LED direct view screen. It's about 30 feet diagonally, so it's like a movie-sized screen, but it's a direct view projector. So we'll be taking advantage of that. And the Sony folks who are members of SMPTE have offered to maybe have a movie, so we'll be able to watch something on that giant screen.
Right, and it's something like about 6,000 pixels across. It's going to be fed in 4K as part of the standard setup there. And as Pat said, yes, it's a brand new facility. It comes online around the end of the year. They're going to start testing it pretty soon, as soon as we get the power back on up there. Yeah, so we're really looking forward to that one. We're lining up a great number of good speakers, some who've been speakers here before, some who are coming back, some new people, and yeah, AI and machine learning is definitely a very hot topic. So we're very excited to hear what people are doing, especially people like Google are doing in that front.
So I encourage you to mark your calendars for that. And Keith, the San Francisco section, we do these section events pretty much about once a month. How many members do we have in the San Francisco section now?
Oh gosh, it's over 400, I think now. Yeah, so.
And we make the rounds. Been to Google last year at the Microsoft campus. Folks in Pixar have hosted us up in Emeryville from time to time. So lots of good stuff. And if you like this,
ILM,
please join.
We went up to ILM.
Oh yes, Industrial Light and Magic. That's right.
Yep. And so we move the meetings around a little bit so that everybody, as Patrick knows, gets a fair shot at a crappy commute.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, and thanks for coming. I'll turn it back over to you, Keith.
Well, those AES members, I think I still have my lav on, in the room who are not SMPTE members, I'd encourage you to join SMPTE as well. While SMPTE has not historically been thought of as an audio-oriented group, we're an audio-oriented group. Brian Vessa and the 25CSS team are doing more than just cinema sound, and they're doing sound as well, and you have a chance to get to know and talk with a number of the mix engineers that are involved both in Hollywood and in the North Bay. So it's a good opportunity to learn more and contribute more.
And thank you for the reminder. It takes me back to the 1-inch machine there. In fact, I go back a little further than that one.
No, that's
that's a
VPR3.
it's VPR. Actually, no, that's a probably a VPR 80 or a 6.
No,
The 3 was the one with the big
yeah,
guides down the side. But in that format, that's probably either an 80 or a 6. But yeah, good old Ampex machines.
Good old rotating rust heads.
Yes,
right,
absolutely.
right.
So once again, thanks very much to Cisco for hosting us tonight, and stay tuned for more information about the next meetings.